Hello and welcome to the final part of
Legends of 2011.
the GTX 570. This wasn't the video I was expecting to make, but I guess that's computers for you. Why is the GTX 570
legendary?
When it launched in December 2010 for $349, the GTX 570 brought previous gen top-tier performance to the masses, although these days it would be more accurate to say 80 series performance, as today the RTX 4070 performs roughly around the same as the original RTX 3080, but wouldn't it be nice if it was top tier? The GTX 570 draws 219 watts of power from two 6-pin PCIe power connectors. That's 50 watts more than the GTX 560 Ti, but over 100 watts less than the HD 6950, which can draw up to 335 watts. I won this card at auction on eBay for 14 Great British pounds and 50 Great British pence, around $18 US, and it can be purchased in the UK from CEX for 20 Great British pounds. Checking the specs in GPU-Z, the GTX 570 has 480 unified shaders, 40 ROPs and 60 TMUs. The memory bus is 320 bits, connected to 1280 megabytes of GDDR5 memory, giving 160 gigabytes a second bandwidth. Even to this day, Nvidia are keeping up the proud tradition of just enough video memory. Some say it's to force obsolescence in around 1 to 2 generations, or you could look at it as just good business sense. Why spend money on something that won't be used? Well, we'll find out. This GTX 570 has a slight factory overclock, so the core clock is 770 MHz. The memory is clocked at 1000 MHz, and the shader clock is 1540 MHz. Drivers are 391.35, the last release for the GeForce Fermi cards. There's no surprises in Heaven 4.0, with the GTX 570 outperforming the 560 Ti by around 12%, and the 6950 by around 10%. Scoring 1068 points with a frame rate of 42.4 frames per second. Battlefield 3 at 1080p medium is great on the GTX 570, where it comfortably beats the previous two cards with an average frame rate of 88.5 frames per second. That's over 10 frames per second faster than the HD 6950. At the 1% low, the GTX 570 is in the lead again, delivering 52.7 FPS, which is more than 5 FPS better than the other two cards. All the cards come together at the 0.1% low to deliver around 25 FPS. The GTX 570 isn't the best in this measure at 25.9 FPS, but it's within a margin of error of the other two cards. If all you want to play in 2023 is Battlefield 3, then sure, buy a GTX 570. It'll do a good job. Unsurprisingly, Skyrim at 1080p medium is almost rock solid on the GTX 570, as it was with the GTX 560 Ti. But the 570 is able to push slightly higher 1% and 0.1% lows. It's tied with the GTX 560 Ti for the average frame rate with 59.9 FPS. But the 6950 wins by 0.1 FPS with 60 frames per second. At the 1% low, the GTX 570 delivers 59.7 FPS to the GTX 560 Ti's 59.4 FPS, while the 6950 drops to 42.8 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the GTX 570 delivers 56.9 FPS, while the 560 Ti can only manage 56.1 FPS, and the 6950 has dropped down to 40.1 FPS. Medium settings didn't tax the Nvidia GPUs enough to show a clear advantage. High settings would have been a better choice for these cards, but I think the 6950 is best at medium. In Crysis 2, we see a GTX 560 Ti beating a GTX 570, with the 560 Ti delivering an average frame rate of 56.9 FPS, compared to the GTX 570's 53 FPS, and the 6950 comes in not far behind with 51.1 FPS. The natural order of things is restored at the 1% and 0.1% lows, with the GTX 570 delivering a much better 1% low at 33.9 FPS, compared to the 560 Ti's 30.9 FPS or the 6950's 26.6 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the GTX 570 again delivers a much better result with 25.15 FPS, an improvement over the 560 Ti's 22.3 FPS or the 6950's 20.5 FPS. The GTX 570 runs Crysis, and it does it arguably better than the other two cards, delivering a smoother experience in this title. In Deus Ex Human Revolution, I'd set the bar too low again. This time the normal preset, even with MLAA enabled, it isn't enough to tax any of these cards, and so we have a plateauing of performance at the average frame rate, with all cards delivering around 60 frames per second. However, the 570 actually does deliver 60 frames per second. At the 1% low, all cards deliver within a margin of error around 58 FPS, and at the 0.1% low, all cards deliver between 56 and 57 FPS. Deus Ex Human Revolution is still well worth a playthrough in 2023, and any of these cards will give you a 60 FPS experience at these settings. The GTX 570 trounces all the other cards in The Witcher 2. While its average frame rate of 81.6 frames per second is only 8 FPS faster than the 6950's 73.3 FPS, it's at the 1% and 0.1% lows where it really impresses. The GTX 570 delivers a 1% low of 59.6 FPS, nearly 12 FPS better than the next card, the GTX 560 Ti at 48 FPS, while the 6950 is down at 42.7 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the GTX 570 is over 20 FPS faster than the other cards in this metric, at 51.5 FPS. In The Witcher 2, with a GTX 570, you could start turning up the detail a little, and it would still perform very well. Portal 2 at 1080p is another instance where the GTX 560 Ti is delivering a better average frame rate at 204.1 frames per second, compared to the GTX 570's 181.45 frames per second. Both Nvidia cards are still miles faster than the 6950. At the 1% low, the 560 Ti and 570 are tied with results within a margin of error, around 53 to 54 FPS, and the 6950 delivered a poorer 24.7 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the GTX 570 demonstrates its superior gaming ability with 36.6 FPS, which is much better than the Ti's abysmal 4.8 FPS or the 6950's still bad 15.6 FPS. I would definitely recommend Portal 2, and you could do it on a GTX 570 with very nice performance. Once again, in Arkham City, the GTX 560 Ti is delivering a faster average frame rate at 55.4 FPS, and I'm definitely beginning to worry that I've made some error in my measurements. The 570 comes in at 49.2 frames per second, but should be performing around 10% faster than the 560 Ti. And then there's the HD 6950 bringing up the rear with 47.5 frames per second. At the 1% low, the 570 ties with the 6950 at 34 FPS, while the 560 Ti drops to 13.6 FPS. Things look much better for the 570 at the 0.1% low, as it delivers the best result at 24.1 FPS, followed by the 6950 at 18.6 FPS, and finally the 560 Ti with an abysmal 6.4 FPS. The GTX 570 is the better card, as it's able to give a higher average frame rate and 0.1% low than the HD 6950, while the 560 Ti suffers from terrible frame pacing that will really ruin your experience in this title. Assassin's Creed Revelations gives expected results, with the GTX 570 the top performer across the board. The 570 delivers an average frame rate of 116.2 frames per second, nearly 6 FPS faster than the 560 Ti, and nearly 40 FPS faster than the 6950. It has the best 1% low with 51.7 FPS, which is 10 FPS higher than the 560 Ti at 41.1 FPS, with the 6950 coming in at 37.8 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the 570 delivers a very nice 33.5 FPS, 5 FPS faster than the 6950 at 28 FPS. The 560 Ti is coming in last at 16 FPS. There's no question in this title, the 570 is the best of the bunch in Assassin's Creed Revelations and provides a very nice experience at these settings. Dawn of War 2 produces another strange result. The GTX 570 wins the average frame rate with 79.7 frames per second, but loses to the 560 Ti on the other metrics, so there must be something going on. At the 1% low, the 570 is 2 FPS slower than the 560 Ti with 28.6 FPS compared to the Ti's 30.8 FPS, while the 6950 delivers a not great 23.5 FPS. At the 0.1% lows, there's just 2 FPS between all the cards, with the 560 Ti on top with 17.7 FPS and the 570 bottom with 15.6 FPS. I ran this benchmark multiple times and the 570 never came out on top against the 560 Ti, but the 570 still gives comparable performance to the other cards, and you'd have the same experience on either Nvidia card, with the 6950 a little bit worse. Saints Row the Third caused me some trouble, as it ran well on the GTX 560 Ti, but on the GTX 570 not so well. The only thing I could think of was that now we were in an open world area which could be placing far more demand onto the GPU. The average frame rate for the GTX 570 was 43.5 frames per second, only 2.5 FPS slower than the 560 Ti at 46 FPS, while the 6950 was delivering 34.8 FPS. At the 1% low, while the GTX 560 Ti delivered 31.6 FPS, the 570 could only manage 20.9 FPS in the open world area, while the 6950 practically stopped at 1.8 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the 570 drops to 2.8 FPS, only slightly better than the 6950's stationary 0.6 FPS, while the 560 Ti was way out with 29.4 FPS. The open world area must be far more demanding than the introductory level, and this is a failure on my part. I would have expected the 560 Ti to perform equally as poorly in this section of the game, and as a result, I would say no card is suitable for the remaster of Saints Row the Third. As LA Noir's average frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second, all cards performed the same, with the GTX 570 delivering 29.9 frames per second, the GTX 560 Ti delivering 29.9 frames per second, and the HD 6950 delivering 29.9 frames per second. At the 1% low, the GTX 570 delivers the best performance with 28.1 FPS, followed by the 560 Ti at 25.1 FPS, and lastly the 6950 at 24.6 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the 570 takes the lead with 22.1 FPS, followed by the 560 Ti with 19 FPS, and lastly the 6950 with 15.6 FPS. The GTX 570 was the best performer in this title with its stronger 1% and 0.1% lows, and would be subjectively smoother in LA Noir. Our last title is World of Tanks, and I'm going to say I had to apply a massive update before I could run the benchmark, so I'm going to attribute performance differences down to different versions of the game. The 6950 retains top spot with 64.1 frames per second, followed by the 560 Ti with a close 62.2 frames per second, and our most powerful card, the GTX 570, comes in last with 57.4 FPS. At the 1% low, the 6950 is still on top with 40.9 FPS, then the 560 Ti with 39.8 FPS, and finally the 570 comes in with an OK 32.3 FPS. At the 0.1% low, the 560 Ti and 570 are close, but not close enough, with the 570 delivering 16.7 FPS and the 560 Ti a better 18.7 FPS. The 6950 produces a poorer 0.1% low of 8.9 FPS, indicating potential stutter in this title. World of Tanks is another title where my GTX 570 underperformed. It wasn't a bad performance and would certainly have been very playable, but it's been bested by a lower tier card. This GTX 570 has given us some interesting results. It was the fastest in Battlefield 3, Skyrim, The Witcher 2 and Assassin's Creed Revelations, but fell short or matched the 560 Ti in other titles. Looking at the 1% and 0.1% results, I would say that the GTX 570 did a better job, outclassing the 560 Ti and 6950 more often than not, but it's the instances where it performs worse than the GTX 560 Ti that concern me. So what happened? Well, some of you may have noticed I had a GTX 1050 installed that I was using to offload video encoding, and I'd installed this for the 6950 video. When you install a second card, it bisects the PCIe bus, so our 6950 and GTX 570 were running at PCIe 2 times 8. This could have been limiting our performance. I uninstalled the 1050 and ran Heaven again, and this time we got a result of 1123 points with an average frame rate of 44.6 frames per second. That's an increase of 5%, but still doesn't account for the poor performance of my GTX 570, as it should have been around 5% faster than the GTX 560 Ti. Guys, I f***ed up on this one, and I'm sorry, but that can't be the whole story. I released the 560 Ti video back in March 2023. That's over 6 months ago, and since then there's been a number of Windows and game patches released. I think this is also contributing to the poorer performance seen on the HD 6950 and GTX 570. These cards are long out of support, so it makes sense that software changes have a detrimental impact on performance. Speaking of support, it's a big reason why I can't recommend any of these cards in 2023. Take a look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider here, and these games either show a warning or won't start at all. Looking on eBay for graphics cards sold for 20 Great British Pounds or less, there are better options available, such as the R9 270, R9 280, GTX 660 Ti, 670, 770, and even a GTX 950. All of these cards sold for 20 Great British Pounds or less and would be better choices than our 2011 graphics cards. These are just too out of date now. Next year we'll be building a 2012 machine with an i5-3570K and loads of 2012 GPUs, such as the GTX 660 Ti and AMD 7870 XT. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time, Rammers.